Good morning, I'm Asha Nayaswami. We're continuing our conversation about the gurus of this line of self-realization. So let's begin with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahasaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we open our hearts and minds to be transformed in your presence. We are your children. Take us by the hand, walk us step by step through all the adventures of this incarnation. Then take us lovingly across the great divide between this world and the astral world. Help us to feel that there is no change between darkness and light, between happiness and sadness, that our lives are one continuous experience of your loving presence within. Om, peace. Amen. Today I'm going to continue to talk about Lahiri and also a little about Babaji, because of course Lahiri was Babaji's disciple, and one of the glorious stories in Autobiography of a Yogi is how Lahiri met Babaji and how he was initiated into Kriya and all that happened. Yesterday I started talking about the city of Varanasi, of Benares, where Lahiri had his home and acted out the drama of his divine incarnation. And I was setting the stage with what a magnificent, ancient, and deeply spiritual city it is. None of this happens by accident. Oftentimes when women have come into the temple dedicated to Master that we have here in Palo Alto, where I've been for many years, they'll look at all the pictures of the men on the altar, and sometimes there's this, sometimes belligerent, sometimes merely inquiring, why are there no women on the altar? And it's a very good question. This is our line of gurus, and they're all men. I asked Swamiji that question once, and his answer was interesting, picking it up from a completely different string. He said, well, a master can choose his body. He could just as easily be female as male. And then he said, being an avatar is a masculine kind of job, which is an interesting way to put it, because it's an outward moving, world changing. Being a saint, it has nothing to do with God realization. It has to do with the assignment that they're given from the divine. And it's masculine in the sense that it's very active in the world. Even when you have great saints like Anandamoyi Ma, for example, she had no organization, she did no particular work. She sat there for decades and uplifted and blessed people. But she never, she behaved like a mother. She just behaved in an accepting, motherly way and never went into the world and did a work. In a work, by that I mean in something that showed in a tangible, material sense. It's just the way things are. I have absolutely no explanation for it. But the point I was trying to say in it is that there's no aspect of the guru's life that is accidental or that is not consciously designed for the furtherance of the divine mission. Because when an avatar incarnates, he has no karma of his own. This is Jesus put it in the Bible. I was born without sin, is how Jesus described himself. Sin is ignorance, wrong action because of ignorance. And it's the same word really as karma. It's just a different way of saying the same thing. So that was Jesus' way of saying that he was a fully self-realized master. So when each of these masters incarnates in the world, everything about their incarnation is because it works for that pattern. So the fact that that the beginning of Kriya Yoga being brought back into the world emanated from the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world on the banks of the Ganges, which is a place that even Indians revere in their own holy land. They revere Varanasi as one of the holiest places within their holy land. And it was right there that Lahiri was planted. And it was from there that the power of Kriya emanated. Lahiri Mahasaya was a householder, which is one of the notable characteristics of him in terms of thinking of our line of gurus, which was a departure from um, the way avatars had been manifesting for a period of time, because through Kali Yuga, the the civilization itself became so dense, is the only way you can think of it, that the way the masters explain it, it was very difficult to hold a high spiritual priority and simultaneously participate in the conditions of the world, because the conditions of the world were just too dense to allow that kind of spirituality. So spirit and matter divided to a certain extent. This is the era of the in India of all the saints and sadhus are up in the Himalayas. In the West, they're behind the walls of monasteries, even in cloistered cells within those monasteries, because you just had to turn your back on the world in order to be able to focus on spirit. But now we're moving into a higher age, an age where energy is the issue, not the form. When the form is the issue, you're either living in the world or you're living for God. But if energy is the issue, you can carry that energy into any circumstance, which is why we see this sort of the many of the most spiritually inspired people are stepping into the world instead of away from it. An interesting example is Mother Mary appeared in Medjugorje, and she started appearing to children, a group of children, about 30 years ago. She's still appearing to those same visionaries, some of them every day still, and others less often, but still regularly. In almost all of the visions, and I want to say all, but perhaps not 100%, of the visions of Mary that have come in the past, the visionary ended up in a monastery. All of the Medjugorje visionaries, Mary instructed them to marry. So they that just completely broke the pattern. They have lived the same level of absolute dedication to God, but they've lived it in a family context, marrying and in some cases having children, raising families, because that's the example for this age, where it's the consciousness with which you do it, that form alone does not define your spirituality. People in the past gained confidence in their spirituality from the form they were following. In a higher age, you can't fool yourself by just looking right. You have to actually be what that is in your own self. Master himself revered Saint Francis and called him my patron saint. But he said Francis worshipped Lady Poverty, and Master said, I worship Lady Simplicity. And so it moved. So Master was able to make his headquarters in this big, what used to be a hotel in Los Angeles. And, it was what do you say? It was a beautiful setting. Whereas Francis, had no home at all, and he lived in a stable or lived outside, because the form of what he did in that age, it had to be very extreme, because the conditions, well, as Swami put it, conditions were so uncomfortable anyway. If you were going to do tapasya, you had to go a lot farther. But in this age, it's not necessary. Consciousness is everything. So Lahiri was the beginning of this. Kriya Yoga is described as an ancient technique that has been known to saints and sages throughout all of time, because it's Sanatan Dharma, which is to say, it's based on that which is. It's not an invention. It's not somebody's bright idea. It's an internal discovery of the way spirit and the physical body work together, the way ego and the infinite work together, and it's it's perceived. It's a revelation. And so certain use of your breath, use of your concentration, paying attention to the chakras, concentrating at the spiritual eye. These are just the way things are. So great saints and sages throughout all of time and all into the future will discover the same things. Um, but during the Kali Yuga eras, during the Dark Ages, man's consciousness was too low, as a culture, as a mass civilization, to be able to appropriately understand these techniques, use them properly, and not misuse them for dark purposes. So the Himalayan masters, Babaji and the others, basically took the technique and hid it in the mountains. And it wasn't that qualified chelas couldn't find and learn, because the yugas are just the backdrop for the individual drama. So there's always saints and masters, and there's always their disciples, and there's always great souls in every yuga. Just they're there if it's the appropriate place for them to be. Jesus came Kali Yuga descending. It just got worse and worse after he died, but he was a fully self-realized master, and many of his disciples were liberated. So it's more the way civilization expresses, not a limitation on the individual soul. But this power, the greatest power that India had to offer, they hid it away in the mountains. But then Jesus comes to Babaji and says, the age is changing. Dwapara Yuga is coming. It's time, for us to begin to participate in the progress of the world in a very different way. And so that agreement was made between Jesus and Babaji, between East and West, in a very symbolic and literal sense, that we need to bring East and West together, and we need to reignite spiritual understanding, and we need to integrate spirituality back into civilization as a whole. So this whole group of masters, who seems to operate as a team, everybody took their incarnation in their right place. Master made the comment that Lahiri was lucky, because his entire incarnation, there were no wars. Master said that he went through the First World War, the Second World War, the Korean War, 3 wars in the short span of his life, and his life wasn't even long. And for a tender-hearted master who's omnipresent in his experience, that kind of suffering is intensely difficult. But Lahiri's life, his karma, his personality, whatever that would mean, was and is seemingly entirely different. Master has often been a warrior and a general and a leader of his forces in other incarnations, where he's just, that's the kind of job that he does. He was Arjuna, he was on the field of battle even at that time. He was William the Conqueror. It's just, these are even the phrase, the conqueror. But Lahiri was quite different. So Lahiri also had the destiny to live as a householder, because it needed to be expressed that living in the world, raising a family even, is no obstacle to spiritual life, that the only obstacle to spiritual life is internal, that there's no external obstacle, because the divine is equally present everywhere, and the only question is whether or not we're attuned to it. So even though Lahiri was an avatar, and therefore God realized from before his birth, and when he finally meets his guru again, Babaji talks about watching him meditate as a small boy, sitting on the beach, by the ocean, by the river, by the Ganges, just, going into an ecstatic state. So we don't really know that much yet about the life of Lahiri Mahasaya, but there's no question, no matter how humbly he appeared to live, that the full consciousness of the divine was already in him. Perhaps, um, what would you say? Perhaps hidden almost even from himself. Swamiji asked Master once, what is it? When a God realized Master participates in the world, Swami essentially asked him, what is that experience? Are you drawn into the world? And the way Master put it, he said, inwardly you are always free. Now, it's not something that I could penetrate with my mind, but that was how Master answered the question. Inwardly you are always free. So Lahiri was established with a wife, with at least some children. There's some question whether he had two sons that are known, and conceivably he had more children than that as well. Um, Lahiri was in his early 30s. He was established with a wife and children, and he was working as a government accountant in an English office. And I always love that because it's very difficult to imagine a job that you could think of that was just more um, ordinary in its expression. I mean, to be able to work for the English at that period of time indicated a level of education and competence and ability for an Indian to be in that position that was notable. But nonetheless, it was just a mundane job in every way. And then, as it's told in Autobiography of a Yogi, he gets transferred up into the foothills of the Himalayas, and he spends all his spare time wandering in the mountains. So we're also talking about what Lahiri's temperament was. And then I won't tell the whole story because it's told so well in Autobiography of a Yogi. He comes to Babaji, and then there's a sudden awakening in Lahiri. At least that's how the story is told. Sometimes they tell the story in a certain way. They tell one aspect of the story. They tell the way the story is acted out for others, and you don't always know what's inside of it. But in the story, Lahiri discovers that he's a disciple of Babaji and that Babaji has been following him during this interlude and has been waiting for him. And then Babaji welcomes him as a disciple. And if you deeply visualize the words that are being told, Babaji shows how he's kept his blanket, Lahiri's blanket, and his water pot, kept it polished, holding it for him all this time. I mean, this is the disciple, the guru serving the disciple, that he watched Lahiri, as he said, as he reincarnated and as he grew up, holding always this sacred relationship that was untouched by the change of incarnation and the passage of time. So Lahiri is then initiated into Kriya Yoga, reinitiated, you might say, has various miraculous experiences, and just assumes that his life in the city is simply over. I mean, now that he's reunited with his guru, he simply forgets everything. It's quite touching in the stories of one of the visionaries in Medjugorje, and she's married and she has two daughters. And she sees Mary, I believe, once a month. It could be once a week, but I think it's actually once a month. But it's an intermittent, it's not every day. And she was talking to one of the pilgrims, and this pilgrim was a man, and he had 9 children. And Marianne, it's pronounced slightly differently, but that's her name, has 2 daughters. And she's saying to this father, she said, "You know how it is to be a parent. Your children are never out of your consciousness. You're always thinking of your children no matter what." And then the visionary said, "But when I'm with Mother Mary, I forget I have children." She said, "I just forget that I have children. And it's not until I come back into this world again and that the vision disappears." And she said, "And it's always heartbreaking to come back into this world. But that only then does she remember that she has children." So you can imagine Lahiri, just everything about his life up till that point, what does it matter to him? So he assumes he's found his guru and will just live in the Himalayas and will just disappear from that other life. But instead, Babaji tells him that no, actually, it is the divine will that you should be established. And I think they use the word as in your modest householder life. I mean, even the very fact that it was exemplary, but it was still just a modest life that he was living there. He wasn't wealthy. He wasn't well known. He wasn't doing anything that would bring him notoriety or cause the world to change. He was serviceful. He was generous. He was good, but it was a modest householder life. And so, but Babaji says to him, "No, you're not going to be able to stay with me. You have to go back." And then he says, "You have to, when you find those who are willing to renounce everything for God, then you should initiate them into Kriya, because Babaji's staying in the Himalayas, but it's time for Kriya to make its way into the world. So they have that exchange. And then Lahiri says, in so many words, if I have to wait for those who are willing to renounce everything, I'm not going to be initiating very many people. And he says, but there are many souls, sincere souls, because this is the life that Lahiri has been living, who would be greatly uplifted by learning Kriya. So then we have this beautiful exchange between Babaji and Lahiri as described in the book. And Babaji says, through you the divine has spoken. And then give Kriya to all those who sincerely seek. So at that moment, it's like the whole shift from Kali Yuga to Dwapara really began. Because now, instead of having to separate ourselves from society, right where we're living, Kriya is going to come to us. So we can begin the process, which is what Ananda and all of us are doing now, of spiritualizing life itself, which is how we move into the higher ages. In the higher ages, the sadhus had wives. I mean, the saints had wives, and they lived in ashrams, and just the whole culture ran on a spiritual basis. And I was talking to Swami once about Satya Yuga, which is the highest age. He sort of shrugged it off and said, well, it's still the material world. It's not God realization. But he said, in Satya Yuga, people like us are in charge. I said, you mean then the whole world operates like Ananda? He said, yes. It operates on friendship and cooperation and God realization and Dharma and shared attunement. I mean, quite a different picture than the world we live in now, where greed and money and personal power and violence when necessary are the coin of commerce, is the means of interchange in the world right now. But a revolution is starting. A revolution started when Lahiri met Babaji and when Babaji said, go back. So Lahiri just comes out of the mountains, completely changed now, eventually makes his way, gets transferred back, ends up in Varanasi. Now, yesterday I was talking about the river and the ancient buildings. So this was like a little less than 200 years ago that Lahiri was there, and which is not a long time in the city of Varanasi. So I'm going to presume that the place we went to find his house was more or less as it was when Lahiri was there, undoubtedly less crowded, but nonetheless. And so there's a section of Varanasi which is the ancient city, the oldest ancient part of the city, and they call it the narrow lanes, the narrow lanes. And this is where Master also met Sri Yukteswar. He was going through the narrow lanes of the city, which is well known, and Sri Yukteswar was standing at the end of the lane, and Master tried to go past him and just saw him briefly, and then found that he couldn't walk away. He was mystically drawn, and then he turned and met Sri Yukteswar. Interesting, same city. And so this is where Lahiri has his home, and you go through these very narrow lanes, quite, as I say, quite crowded now, with the houses up on both sides, and you come to a very unassuming wooden doorway and step into it. And Lahiri's house was quite modest. I mean, the courtyard was the size of a living room. It wasn't like a lavish big building. And the room where Lahiri sat meditating is like the size of a modest bedroom. So it's not like it's some glorious palace or some museum. The wonderful thing about it, when I was allowed inside of it, it was still the home of the Lahiri family. So it hadn't been turned into a museum. It was just where they lived. Now we weren't allowed. We weren't allowed actually inside. We weren't allowed beyond the courtyard, but we could go to the doorway of the room where Lahiri sat. Because what happens when Lahiri goes back, he just continues his same duties. But of course, he had already been a great soul and was undoubtedly meditating. And I mean, all of it is, I don't want to say to take it with a grain of salt, but it's a lila. And there's no English equivalent for the word lila, because it just means divine play. And in English, we don't talk about God in that way. And divine play has a particular meaning. It really, the word play on one hand means like children, like the divine is playing. The divine is just joyfully running out, and just how children run out and play. They don't really necessarily have a plan. They just run out and play, and they go here and they go there, and they have their imagination suggest this and then suggest that, and then they burst into tears, and then they make up again, and that's really what God is doing through all of us. We're all just running around expressing our exuberant life force, but we think we're in charge and we're doing it, but it's really the divine always acting through us. It's also a divine play in the sense of theater, which is we're this huge repertoire company, and we just keep incarnating and taking different roles. And the divine has a plot that it's playing out through each one of us. Each one of us is the star of our own production. This is the spirit is center everywhere, circumference nowhere. It's equally centered everywhere. And so I and you, there's a script that's written by our karma. And but the script is written by our karma, and then it's the power of God impels us. We can't drop out of it because we're enmeshed. But it's the part that we're assigned to. We just, in the astral world, we start a role. Master described when, from the perfect infinite freedom of spirit, which is the consciousness of an avatar, and I'm using his words because I have no experience of this. He says when he incarnates and he sees the personality he has to assume, he says at first it's like wearing a heavy overcoat on a hot day. He says it's confining and itchy and uncomfortable to be suddenly just this one personality again. He said, but after a while you get used to it. I mean, I have no idea what any of that means, but that's all the definition of Leela. The avatar assumes a personality and he gets used to it. He's always free in his heart. He never ceases to know his infinity, but he commits himself wholeheartedly to play it out as the way it's supposed to be played, because this is the role I've been assigned, and I will do it with my whole heart. And I will participate as if there were no other reality. I become completely committed to it. That's a very important part of what the example that the master set for us is. We sometimes imagine having the knowledge of a transcendent reality that we're uncommitted to the part we're going to play. But if you're going to act in a play, you have to be absolutely committed to that role, or else nothing in the story moves as it's meant to story. You can't be a bad actor in God's play. You have to be a very good actor in God's play. So Lahiri is now sent back, and he has to be a very good actor. Now he has this knowledge of Babaji and this tremendous assignment that he's supposed to do, and he has to, but still, he has to raise his children. He has to be a good citizen. He has to do all the services that he did, helping others. After his working hours, he served his English bosses. There's a wonderful story in Autobiography of a Yogi of how he bilocated to where his boss's wife was ill in England, and appeared in her room and did a miraculous healing for her, because the husband was very worried, being thousands of miles away. So Lahiri said, let me see what I can do. And he goes into a quiet room, and he goes to where she is, and he heals her with his light. And then he comes back and he assures her husband that she's fine, and even now she's writing you a letter. And then when the wife eventually came to Varanasi and saw him, she recognized him as the being of light who had come to her and healed her in her sickness. So Lahiri participated in remarkable ways in the world around him, but for the most part, he continued to live as he had lived before. Now, it seems that we're going to talk about Lahiri again tomorrow, because there's still a great deal more to say that I haven't been able to say. So for now, God bless you.